never leaves our environment.
Thanks, Alison. Rushanara.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of follow-ups, one on fraud, and then I'll go on to borders. You earlier on you talked extensively about fraud and what you've been doing to tackle it. I mean, one estimate is that about £6.7 billion was lost in fraud related to the COVID era, and the NAO has warned that straightforward measures to tackle fraud were not introduced until months after the COVID business support schemes were launched. And you'll obviously be aware of Lord Agnew having quit because he felt that the government's approach was desperately inadequate to stop taxpayers' money being stolen. So I just wanted to get a much clearer idea of how much COVID-related fraud you think you can still go after to try and recover some of that. Just a particular figure will be useful because it's quite easy to get lost in the weeds otherwise. And also on the Public Accounts Committee report, they state that about 13 billion was spent on sourcing PPE contracts, and there are still disputes with suppliers for 176 contracts worth about 2.7 billion. Could you tell us what amount of that might account for fraud? And if you can't answer that question, I'd appreciate a written response with some details on that, but some overarching figures on what we're looking at in terms of cost to the taxpayer of fraud.
So, I can't give you evidence about PPE contracts because that's not within my area of responsibility. The three main support schemes that I administered were the furlough scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, and Eat Out to help out. And we have been very transparent and published two sets of estimates with our best estimate of what we think the error and fraud was in those schemes. Our latest estimate is £4.5 billion.
How much of that do you think you can get back?
So we're not going to give up on getting it all back, but our current forecast is about £1.1 billion. I think we will probably exceed that, but at the point when we wind up the task force, that is our current forecast of how much we will have recovered. So it's roughly.
You're looking to write off about.
Well, we're not planning to write off anything.
If you wind down the tax task force after recovering $1 billion, what happens then?
So we're not planning to write off anything. If we can detect risks that need to be investigated, we still have all of our compliance staff, over 28,000 of them, who can be deployed on this work. But our intention is, once we have wound up the task force, that we will manage this risk alongside all of the tax compliance risks that we manage. So we will continue.
Let's say, if you were saying you said just over 4 billion, you get $1 billion back, just over $1 billion back through this tax, this process. But after that, it's sort of integral, by the sounds of things, to core business. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it will now thereafter will be managed alongside all of the other compliance risks that we manage, and we'll deploy our resources on that, as well as tax compliance risks, depending on.
Do you expect that to generate less money back in terms of recovery than the current arrangements you've got?
I think
it would be helpful to understand what that will actually mean then, because you've given a very helpful figure in what you think you can recover.
We have no forecast beyond the £1.1 billion that we expect to have recovered by the time we've wound down the task force. Obviously, as time goes on, yes.
Why not hold on to the task force if it's going to bring you back $1 billion? Because otherwise, it just seems like, there's no clear line of sight on whether you're going to recover much more out of the $3 billion odd that's outstanding. And it's just going to get morphed into whatever you do within the overall system. And it's really hard to hold you to account, your organisation to account, and government to account on what could be recovered without clarity on a similar process that you've got at the moment. And I suppose I'm asking because it begs the question whether there should be a special imperative like this task force, and it should continue going forward to recover more of that $4 billion. The outstanding $3 billion, say.
First of all, on the sort of transparency and holding us to account, I think the UK has been more transparent, I think, than any other country.
With respect, we have seen a lot of fraud, COVID-related fraud, for reasons we are all familiar with, well rehearsed. But the taxpayer, at the moment, is having to pay a great deal in terms of the cost of living crisis, and a lot of money, billions, have been wasted during that period, and they're all asking us, go after the money that fraudsters have taken, and that's why we need to make sure that everything is done by this agency and others to recover money that has gone into the wrong hands, hard-earned taxpayers' money.
So I agree with that. Our approach was, first of all, to protect these schemes from error and fraud wherever we possibly can, but we had to balance that with the need to get money out to people who needed it.
I understand. We've been through
quickly.
this many times. That's not the basis for my questions, because we completely understand that, and we've gone through that during the pandemic. I fully understand that. But what I essentially trying to understand from you now is, this task force sounds like a good thing. Why not continue with it? Is there a resource issue? Should we be arguing with the government to give you more support and resource so that you can continue to do that? And can we have some clarity on what's going to happen with the outstanding amount? But I'm going to have to move on. But perhaps you can write to me.
If I can just say, we are clear that the rate of return that we can get from the task force, will diminish over time, and we can get a better rate of return from that resources deployed on the tax gap after a particular point. And the judgment that we have reached is that between April 23 and September 23, it is better to redeploy those resources onto the tax gap, but to continue chasing.
I think it would be really helpful to have some granularity on that part, on what that means, I think, because 3 billion is not nothing. It's a lot of money. So it would be really useful for us to understand the thinking that goes on behind that. So if we can have that, that would be really helpful. Turning to a related question, which is to do with a particular case in terms of sort of whether tax whether tax has been paid, and it might be useful for me to come back to you, send you something in writing in relation to a case that's in the public domain at the moment. But I'm conscious that obviously in specific cases it's hard for you to get into the detail. But it would be helpful to understand what HMRC can do in relation to whether tax is paid or not on earnings based on contracts that have been secured and so on. So I'll come back to, perhaps I can write to you about that. I just wanted to go on to some questions about borders. When you spoke at the committee in December 2020, Jim, prior to the end of the Brexit transition period, you said that you were determined to make sure there was no disruption at the border. How do you think the last 2 years of HMRC, overseeing border controls have gone?
So I believe we have implemented now import controls between the EU and the UK, with the exception of Ireland. That was done without disruption to the flow of trade. I'm confident that the introduction of customs controls has been handled in a way that has not disrupted that. However, it has involved a significant degree of change for traders to take on board, learning new procedures and taking on new costs associated with that. We have put out extensive guidance and education for those traders to help them, as well as funding investment in the intermediaries market to expand that market to support those traders. And then we have a government-funded service for people who are moving goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to make sure that they can cope with the arrangements that have been put in place for the Northern Ireland Protocol without cost. The cost is borne by the government.
There are reports that there's a reduction by about 40% in terms of UK exports into the EU. So have some of the issues been resolved because people are just not exporting?
I think I've seen articles in the last couple of days which actually rather selectively and misleadingly, in my view, quote some trade statistics. Actually, if you look at the statistics between those 2 years, the amount of exports from the UK to the EU did not reduce like that, but they've basically taken two specific lines out of the statistics. So I'm happy to write to you with fuller information on that. But there is no doubt that traders are now having to deal with customs procedures that they did not have to deal with. How
much sort of bureaucracy is that is that compared to what was there before?
So, you know, in the past, for example, there was no need to make any customs declaration. Now there must be a customs declaration for every movement of goods. Those declarations, the administrative cost of completing them varies quite a bit depending on the channel that they use, but I think the last estimate was roughly about £55 per declaration.
And how many declarations are we talking about?
I mean, I don't have that to hand, but it will be millions.
Millions, yeah. So we've got your annual accounts announced that 45,000 traders have used the trade support service to process over 1.9 million consignments.
Yeah, so the Trader Support Service is the government-funded service to help traders who are moving goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
How would you assess the goods flow between GB and Northern Ireland, and how well that you're processing?
So there are, you know, whilst we have put in place certain easements, nevertheless there are customs-like procedures that need to be followed. But what the government has done is fund the Trader Support Service, which will carry out those procedures on behalf of the trader. Obviously, the trader has to supply them with data, but they will then make the declaration on behalf of the trader, and there is no charge for that service.
Okay. So just one final question. It would be really helpful to get the calculation on the £59 per declaration and the number of declarations, maybe per annum or whatever, you know, the overarching figure. I don't know if you were able to...
We did publish something on the past, but it's quite some time ago, but I can get you the most up-to-date information.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. And now that the tariffs are in place between the UK and the EU, have you seen an increase in smuggling across the border?
Well, there is a zero tariff trade agreement between the UK and the EU, so there should be no need to pay tariffs on British goods being exported to the EU or EU goods being imported into the UK. There have always been borders there, and actually when we were in the EU we had smuggling issues. I mentioned diversion fraud in relation to beer in the past. Some of those risks continue, but because there's a zero...
Have the risks increased, and what's being smuggled?
I think our view is that the risk in relation to EU-UK trade has not significantly increased, but the nature of what we have to do to manage those risks has changed because some of the data flows and systems have changed. But broadly speaking, there is no need for anyone to pay customs duty on when they're importing goods from the EU to the UK.
What sort of stuff's being smuggled?
Well, I mean, I gave the example of alcohol diversion fraud. So that is, if you brew beer in the UK, you don't have to pay excise duty if you're exporting it. So, a common way of trying to evade excise duty is to say, we're selling this beer to people in Belgium, for example. I'm exporting it to Belgium. Actually, it then gets diverted back into the UK. But that is something that existed prior to Brexit. It's still a risk that we have to manage in relation to excise fraud.
Thank you very much, Rushanara. One last question, if I may.